Hello my friends and welcome. I hope you're doing great. By the time I'm recording this video, there are protests happening in Iran. But why not in Russia? Russia has so many casualties in this war. Russian economy is going down. Russian society is being restricted by the Russian regime. I think it's time for Russians to unrest, to protest against tyranny. But we see that nothing is happening. They're calm, they're living their own lives. Ordinary Russians, they're okay with what is happening. But why are they okay? Today I'm gonna answer that question. Let's go. Well, first of all, then the war had started back in February 2022. There was the hope among Ukrainians and among Ukrainian politicians that Russians themselves, they will nail down the Russian regime, because this is so unpopular, and the reason for Russia to start the war, this special military operation, it is nonsense. And we thought that it is understandable also for Russians. But no, despite all of the calls from Ukrainian influencers, Ukrainian politicians, Zelensky personally recorded multiple of the videos for Russians on the Russian language that, guys, you're doing something wrong. Your country has attacked the neighbor, with lots of the cultural ties between our countries. We have relatives there, we have relatives here. I personally have also relatives in Russia. But Putin started this war. And the Russians, they were calm back then and they're calm right now. Well, there are many reasons why is it happening like that, but the main one is that the Russian society is damn sick. They are sick of the chauvinism virus. They think that they're imperialists, they are unique, and they should make Russia big again, to restore the Russian Empire, restore the Soviet Union. They feel insecure because the Soviet Union had collapsed. They do not understand still that Soviet Union was something really terrible and bad, similar to the Nazi Germany, because there were so many repressions against their own people. And still the vast majority of Russians, they support this sort of the ideology of prevailing force, of expansion. Well, how do we know it? Because in 2014, when Putin occupied Crimea, using military force and capturing the local parliament building of Simferopol, Crimean government, Russians were happy about it. Putin's rating skyrocketed up to 83%. Those were the real numbers, guys. It was not the Russian propaganda or something. Really, most of the Russians, they supported this occupation. Oh, we'll have Crimea, such a nice weather there, lots of the resorts, beaches, beautiful Black Sea. Why not? Yeah, so those kind of the imperialist ambitions of entire Russian society, it played the great role, and also it told Putin that he may continue. He might start the war in Donbass and later on even start the special military operation, as he thought it could be a blitzkrieg one, but something really went wrong for the Russian army. You see, during the Soviet times there was the cultivation of the hatred towards everything Western, or hatred towards everything foreign. That's why Russians are chauvinists like that. They hate America, they hate Europe, they hate NATO, and most of all, they hate that people there live better than Russians live in Russia. And this kind of the mindset was confirmed when Russian soldiers entered, for example, Kiev Oblast, Gostomel, Bucha. Those were the fancy areas with nice buildings, houses, and Russians were shocked. Oh, we thought that Ukrainians are subhuman, undeveloped nation, but they live better than us. Let's destroy their households, let's rob them, let's flatline them. That is what happened in Gostomel, Bucha. Russians were just envy. They're envy to what is good, their envy to West. This is actually the paradox of the Russian mindset, because many of them who live in Western countries, in Germany, in the United States of America, they hate the places where they live, but still they live there. They like Putin, they like Russian regime, they are chauvinists. If you check out how they walk in the streets in their pro-Russian parades, how they praise aggression against Ukraine, but they somehow continue to live and pay their taxes for the military support actually of Ukraine, if they live in Germany especially. This is the paradox, and this is nonsense logically, but that is how they were built, by mostly Soviet Empire, especially those Russians who immigrated out of Russia immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed. They don't know what is happening in Russia. They haven't lived under Putin's ruling, and they thought that, oh, it's the Soviet Empire, we like Soviet Empire. You know, then there was the Soviet Union, I was young and my pee-pee was more robust than now, so I like Soviet times, something like that. And if you switch on the Russian TV or Russia Today, whatsoever, They have the cult of war, the cult that they should be afraid of by all of the Western countries. And absolutely the same propaganda that was in the Soviet Union, and still majority of Russians, they support this Russian vector of development, that they should go with war against neighbors. They support Putin. I know what I'm talking about because I watch lots of the videos of our enthusiasts who speak with Russians. There's the Russian analog of Omelja, so the website, it's called Chat Roulette, that connects you to a random viewer or random speaker where you may communicate, two of you. And I see how our Ukrainian guys, they speak with Russians, and after it they publish all of those videos on TikTok. Russians are sick, really, most of them. What they consume from the Russian propaganda TV, they do not even process. They basically give it out loud to the people they are communicating with on this chat roulette. Simply a brainwashed people. This is the psychological sickness of entire nation, and they should go through the process of denazification, because, for example, Germans were also sick with this virus of Nazism before the Second World War and during. But later on, because of the denazification, Putin likes this term, but it definitely was applied, the German society was capable to cure itself from within. So the same thing should be, I guess, applied for Russians, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no process of decommunization. So Russians feel, again, insecure, they feel this hatred, and that they lost this Cold War. You know, they are seeking for some sort of the revenge. They thought that they were conquered. They do not understand that what had happened with the Soviet Union, its collapse, is the greatest thing of the 20th century. For Putin, as he says it openly, it's the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Not the Second World War, no, not Stalin's repressions, no, it's just his empire where he was a respected agent. It collapsed, and now Putin, he's going for full revenge against Western countries. He's saying it openly. He's not fighting against Ukraine, he's fighting against West. And in his eyes, Ukraine is a betrayal country. Those are not Ukrainians. Those are Russians who chose the wrong vector, who were brainwashed. But actually, who is brainwashed here? Russians. It also explains why there are so many volunteers who would like to join the Russian army. Yes, the main driver for them is to earn millions of rubles, but they also watch the Russian propaganda TV, and on the screen, nothing bad is happening. It's like a winter camp, you know, if you join the Russian army, sign the contract right now, you'll be, you know, somewhere behind the front lines. You'll have the best equipment in the world. Maybe you'll be the drone operator, and never ever you'll be fighting with your rifle elsewhere. And the Russians look at everything of that and they think, oh, I will earn money and I'll be a respected guy, especially if they're ex-prisoners or if they're alcoholics, drug addict. Oh, society will respect me. I'll be this veteran of the Russian army. Then I return home. I'll be a hero, and rich hero. That's why they signed all of that bullshit, and they flatline themselves, finding out that it's not what they were told on the Russian propaganda TV. Yes, I also want to say about good Russians. They're out there. In Russia, I don't think about good Russians who live out there right now, because after all, if they work, they pay taxes, and from their taxes they finance the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But those Russians who left Russia, and especially those who support Ukrainian army or Ukrainian people or Ukraine in any sort of the case, of course, for me, those are the good Russians. The Russian opposition, it's also strange. Navalny's wife and all of that organization is just a pure shit show circus, and Navalny's wife is a grifter herself, Yulia Navalny. She was involved herself in multiple of the corruption schemes, and she is not supporting Ukraine even for a bit. Because simply, they're the same chauvinists, but from the different perspective. They're against Putin, but they don't want to return Crimea, for example, for Ukraine. Navalny said about it many of the times, oh, we don't know, we're gonna think Crimea, we don't know whom Crimea belonged to, so fuck them. I can say it because I'm from Crimea, from Sevastopol myself originally, and Crimea is, of course, Ukraine. But again, there are good Russians also in the media sphere. If you watch those influencers who fled Russia, you know what I'm talking about, especially those influencers who do not live in Western countries and complain about their lives, but those who do something real in support of Ukraine and against the Russian regime, because it is very risky for them. They could be fooled by Russian FSB easily. Russia treats them as some sort of the traitors of the country, and Russian intelligence, they have long hands. As we understand, there was the guy who kidnapped the Russian helicopter and who was later on flatlined in Spain. So it's very, very risky for the Russian influencers. But they're doing absolutely great job conquering the Russian propaganda. And those Russians who joined the Russian Volunteer Corps or the Russian Legion, those guys are fighting for Ukraine against the Russian army. Those are, of course, good Russians. They risk their lives on the front lines. This is outstanding, guys. So not all of the Russians are bad, of course. I would be a Nazi saying that, oh, the Russians are bad. But the Russian society is sick. They need cure. And as I mentioned already, there should be some sort of the denazification or de-chauvinization of the Russian society, as it was with Germans before. Germans, their children, they go to school and they have the special classes where they show people what atrocities, what genocide Germans did before. And of course, never again, as they say. But Russians say we can repeat. That's their slogan was. And they cultivated this cult of death, of the Second World War, that it was something really outstandingly good. But no, it was a horrible thing. Russians, they still don't understand it. One more reason why Russians are not protesting against Putin's regime is because their economy level as average is still okay. Russia is under the strict sanctions not for that long, not like in Iran, not like in North Korea, where people are really struggling. No, for Russia it's more or less okay for now. They continue to trade with other countries like, for example, China. China replaced lots of the goods which were previously arriving from the Western countries. Also, actually, Russian economy was growing those 4 years, and 2026 will be the first one of the Russian economy stagflation. Okay, we see something in perspective, that Russian economy may collapse, and Putin himself, plus many of the economy experts in Russia, including the head of the central bank, they say about it openly, about the soft landing of the Russian economy. It's inevitable. So this factor that for Russians it's the normal life, everything is more or less okay, but we don't play PlayStation games, we do not have access to some of the services, and we do not purchase Volkswagen, Audi or BMW. It would be like good times. They will remember those years of the start of the war, how economy was more or less okay, but later on it's gonna crash. It will happen 100%. Russian economy together with Russia will collapse. Sanctions are after all working. The oil prices are going down, and today, yeah, probably on Monday, OPEC countries agreed to increase the oil production once again, almost 500,000 barrels a day. So of course it will drop the prices for oil generally around the world, and especially for the Russian oil, because those consumers, why they would continue to cooperate and trade with Russians? It's kind of risky. Russian shadow fleet is being attacked, captured, those tankers, you know. It's better to trade with other brands, with Saudi oil, American oil, because the price is in general cheap. The low oil prices, they're very great for us, and they're very harmful for the Russian economy. They predicted that the prices this year would be $59 per barrel, but they sell their oil for $36 per barrel right now. 59, 36. But so far the Russian economy visually looks fine. Russians, they have access even to iPhones, so they have everything more or less usual. Some of the replacements, but it's uncomparable to what is happening in Iran. That's why people in Iran, they go on protest, because they live decades in this kind of the poverty under the sanctions, and they don't like Ayatollah regime because of that too. And Ayatollah itself, they're useless, they're incompetent, even in securing their own generals. It was during the strikes of Israel on Iran, American strikes. They're damn stupid. Reminds me also the Russian regime, because it also built this hierarchy of the loyal people but not professionals. In the Russian army it's also visible. So far in this battle for the minds of Russians, TV wins against the refrigerator. If they open the fridge and there is empty, maybe Russians would start to think. One more factor that Putin put the Russian economy partially on the war rails. The Russian military production has expanded. Now there are also problems in that sphere, but lots of the people, they're connected with this military production sector, and their salaries, they also skyrocketed by several of the times. And those Russians who are involved in that, and those are hundreds of thousands of Russians, they're happy about it, and they don't want war to even slow down. They don't want to return to the salaries which are 4 times lower. Because after all, there is the huge inflation in Russia, and the prices, they're growing up tremendously. And if they return back to their previous salaries, they will be even poorer than before. So war is a very, very profitable thing for them. Also for all of those small businesses which provide services for those Russians who are in this military sector. In the towns with military factories, there is the boost of everything, every sort of the service, barber shops and everything. They're opening up, and the salaries are growing for everyone. So yeah, sadly, the vast part of Russians, they're interested in this war, unfortunately. But after all, even they will suffer, because the crisis will touch even the military production. And even in Ural Vagon Zavod, that's one of the main factories of the Russian military, there are some of the layoffs even now, because partially the military production had to be stopped. They are not fulfilling the contracts because of the crises with the loans. So if those Russians in the military, they'll have their hypothec, a cheap credit to buy an apartment. They'll have also this recognition in the Russian society as they do something good for the country, as those Russians who signed the contracts to join the Russian army and flatline in Ukraine. So if Russians involved in military, they'll go on protest, they'll protest against their own jobs. They'll never do it. One more factor why Russians are calm, and it's one of the main ones, is because Putin applied severe repressions against their own people. He did it very sharply, right away after he just started the special military operation. All of the Russian opposition media that was functioning was cancelled right away. And we know the story with Navalny, who returned to Russia. He was stupid enough to return, and who was flatlined later on in a prison. Putin definitely killed him. He doesn't recognize it as some sort of the murder, but he did it, and he showed it openly. Well, actually, Putin applied repressions on Russians even before. He was boiling his own people like that frog, little by little, for them not to feel what is happening. And now no protest is possible for Russians without any sort of the consequences. Yeah, some people like Iranians, they live very terrible life. That's why they're risking even their own lives to go on the streets and protest. Thousands of people were unalived by Ayatollah regime, and we are not sure whether those protests after all could be successful or not, but people, they reached their limit. For Russians, they didn't feel it. It was like repression after repression. Okay, maybe they jailed this guy, but it's not with me, it's not my friend. But now they will jail absolutely everyone for any sort of the thing, even for the comment in internet, for like, for repost. If you say something even close to criticize Putin or Russian army, if you call the war a war, you'll be jailed. Only Putin and Peskov, they might say that the war is a real war, but for everyone else, that's the special military operation, which, as they say, goes according to plan. Yeah, we trust them, absolutely. And that's, by the way, the call for our friends in America. Hello guys, you still have a democracy, but all of the signs that you turn the wrong way, I mean your leaders, turn you to the wrong way, they're with it. So think about it, because the same was happening in Russia. Silencing of the media, silencing of the people who say something against leaders, orange dictator, yeah, applying repressions, Gestapo eyes. Think about it. Yeah, I think after all in America the Trump dictatorship is not possible because Trump is simply damn old. That's the main reason. And the second reason, that he's not competent. He's an idiot. He is wannabe dictator idiot. That's the plus for you. But in Russia, of course, the repressions are crazy, and Russians would risk even their own lives if they go and protest right now. All of the placard protests, they are not possible in Russia any longer. If there are unrest, there will be immediately bloody ones. They would go as a revolution. Well, Russians actually had the chance back in 2023 with Prigozhin's failed coup, but yeah, Prigozhin turned away. He could have saved lots of the Russian lives nowadays on the front lines. Well, maybe he would have sparked the internal war, civil war in Russia, but it's better than for them to fight in Ukraine, right? Also, I remember protests in Belarus back in 2020. Lots of the people went in the streets. Of course, Lukashenko lost the elections. Lukashenko just wrote to him that he won elections with a huge advantage, but people didn't believe him and they went rioting. Those were absolutely huge. And later on, Putin helped Lukashenko. Lukashenko, by force and repressions, nailed down those protests. And also, Belarus people, they already passed this Rubicon. As Russians, for them only a bloody revolution, unfortunately, is possible. Similar to what it was in Ukraine back in 2014, then many of the people, they lost their lives, but finally Yanukovych regime was cancelled. Now, even if Russians go on the streets, they will be packed to the jail, temporary or permanently, depends on what Russian regime would like to do with them. Well, there are some of the minor protests ongoing, but just few people appear. And mostly it's not because of the war against Ukraine, but because, for example, Putin rose the taxes just a little bit by 2% or something, or because Russia cancelled or blocked Roblox, something like that. And those protesters, there are just few of them. And the Russian police doesn't care that much if people are on the streets. Unblock Roblox, unblock, please. This is silly, really silly for Russian society. Also, there is no core of the Russian opposition. There are no leaders. The Russian society is very volatile. All of those leaders of so-called opposition, they left Russia. They're somewhere living their good lives in the Western countries. They want to show that they're important, that they still may influence Russian society, but no, they don't have this actual influence. Their actual goal is to get money from the Western sponsors. They don't have any sort of leverage on Russians who stayed in Russia. Absolutely zero. So as for me, Russian opposition in general is like those parasites. I mean, this FBK, the Anti-Corruption Foundation that was founded by Navalny. Navalny, yes, he lost his life. I support that guy, but his grifter wife and all of that entire organization that was a little bit reformed, this is corrupt thing. There were so many investigations done on them by other real Russian oppositioners or influencers that they are just debunked, busted. They're not real opposition. So Putin now has his perfect environment to act in Russia. He doesn't have any sort of the threats. The only threats potentially for Putin are coming from within his circle. The Russian elite that lost lots of the money, assets in Western countries, their property are being arrested and their money frozen in the Western banks. Even in the neutral countries, as for example Switzerland, Russians cannot take out their money. Russian oligarchs, they're in a deep problem, and they may not protest but start some sort of this internal revolution within Putin's circle. And Putin, he knows that, he is afraid of this scenario, and he takes some precautions. There is special secret service apparatus, the goal of which is to protect Putin personally. That's the only goal why they exist. That's why it's definitely hard to do something with Putin. But actually, Russia lost 1.3 or 1.5 million soldiers in this war. Many were unalived, many were wounded. This number is huge. It is way more than in both of the Chechen wars, way more than in Afghan war. But why Russians are not protesting against even that? Because most of the families, they're being touched. They know someone who is touched, or they touched directly. Relatives, disabled people. Well, the idea for Putin in this war is kind of smart actually, because they mobilize people voluntarily. Those people, in 90 with something % of the cases, they're just walking with their own feet to the Russian military conscription centers and later on appear in Ukraine. And if they die, Russian society is okay with that because it was their own personal choice. But if Russia starts to mobilize people massively, especially conscripts, those are very young people, basically kids, 18, 19 years old, well, that is the different thing. And Putin, he understands that. That's why he wants to avoid this forced mobilization in Russia as far as he can. That's why Russia is willing to pay those millions of rubles for soldiers to join the Russian army voluntarily, because it doesn't create this crack within the Russian society. This is some sort of the contract between Russian regime and Russians themselves. That, okay, you sacrifice your own life, but we pay you money and your family will live better life. You know, you lived in poverty anyways, your life was miserable, so why not to become a hero? That but rich hero. Yes, Russia mobilized like those 300,000 soldiers, but again, they could have refused. There were many of the cases that Russians refused and they were not taken to the front lines just like that, because according to the Russian law by the time, if you refuse to be mobilized, well, you pay just fine. Yeah, pay some money and you're free to go. You're not even jailed. Now, Russia actually changed this legislation. Russia introduced this electronic conscription database, so they might take every sort of the individual particularly and mobilize precisely. If some guy refuses to be mobilized, well, he's been cancelled out from the Russian society. But it only might happen in case Russia will start this massive mobilization once again. So it will be way more effective compared to the previous one that uncovered lots of the flaws, and hundreds of thousands of Russians, they left the country, and Russia is also suffering because of that. So I see just three variants that the protests in Russia are possible. First of all, economy goes dramatically down. Russian people are suffering, and they suffer for extensive period of time. That is what happened to Iranians. Second, massive mobilization that Putin is afraid of. All of the people, conscripts, not conscripts, because Putin needs meat. And this year is decisive actually for Russians, because they're not achieving the goals of the special military operation, and they're running out even of volunteers. Russia has the big population, but it's not infinite. And of course, there is a huge problem with the Russian soldiers nowadays in the Russian army. So Putin has to decide it this year. And the variant number three is the crack within the Russian elite, maybe some sort of the huge oligarch like Sechin, for example, oil magnate. He might start to fuel protests within Russia to replace Putin, but it's very risky for him, because Russian FSB ex-KGB circle, it has now more influence. But as Prigozhin showed, nothing is impossible, and if oligarchs they unite, they might dismiss Putin from power. Yeah, this is the variant if again Russian economy will go down, if again those oligarchs they will continue to lose absolutely everything under Putin's ruling. So guys, once again, thank you so much for watching even my speaking head videos somewhere in the forest. Thank you so much for it. And also thank you for your kind support on Patreon. The link for it is in the video description right below. And thank you also for your kind support on membership if you watch me on YouTube channel. Guys, you're making this content possible absolutely. I'm working for you, and thank you so much for employing me. Plus, please don't forget to press like to this video and subscribe for the channel to boost it in algorithms. I wish you all a peaceful sky wherever you are, and have a great time.